If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where we share true-to-life family stories, tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and sometimes the unexpected justice that follows. If these stories speak to you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Today's story is called The Business Takeover. The words landed like a hammer in the middle of the conference room. Dad, you're too old. You only embarrass us in front of clients. Max Hayes froze where he sat at the long mahogany table, a pen still between his fingers, the tip hovering just above a page of notes he'd been making. For a moment, the room was so silent that he could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the click of someone's pen cap across the table. His son's voice, the voice he had once cradled as an infant, once guided as a boy, now carried the same chill as the steel beams Max had lifted in his younger days. Max was 58 years old. Not young, no. His body bore the marks of labor, the heavy shoulders of a man who had once mixed concrete by hand, the scars across his palms from years of construction work. He had been a builder all his life. First houses, then an idea. Then brick by brick the company that now sat in glass offices downtown with its logo shining in polished brass in the lobby. It had started in a garage back when his wife Ellen was still alive. She would bring him coffee at midnight while he sketched floor plans under the weak glow of a desk lamp. He had believed in the impossible then, and somehow the impossible had bent to his will. Through calloused hands and stubborn grit, he had built something that would outlive him, or so he thought. Now here was his son Evan standing at the head of the table in a tailored suit, speaking as if the father who raised him was nothing more than a dead weight. Max's mind reeled not just from the insult, but from the eyes that followed. The board members shifted uncomfortably. His daughter-in-law Jenna sat with her manicured nails folded neatly on her lap, not looking at him but smirking faintly as though this had been rehearsed. Even the younger employees avoided his gaze, staring down at their laptops, pretending to be busy. He thought of Ellen in that moment. She had been gone for 6 years now, but he could still hear her voice steady and soft, urging him to keep going during the hardest times. She had believed in him when no bank would loan him a dime, when the only collateral he had to offer was his own sweat and his promise to provide for his family. And he had provided. He'd mortgaged their home twice to keep the company alive in the early years. He'd worked until his hands cracked and bled until he came home so tired he couldn't taste his dinner. Ellen would rub his shoulders, whispering one day, "Max, one day Evan will inherit something strong because of you." He had dreamed of this moment being different. He had pictured sitting beside his son, guiding him gently into leadership, watching him carry forward not just the company but the values it was built upon: honesty, resilience, hard work. Instead, Evan's words cut like glass. "Dad, it's time you step back. We can't have you dragging down our image anymore." Max looked around the table. No one met his eyes. His company, the one he had raised like a second child, suddenly felt like foreign territory. He swallowed hard. His chest ached, not from age, but from heartbreak. He wanted to shout, to remind them all, who had laid the foundation, who had paid their salaries when the numbers bled red. He wanted to tell Evan about the nights he had slept in the office, about the meals he had skipped so the company could survive. But the words stuck in his throat. All he managed was a nod, slow and deliberate. Then he leaned back in his chair, staring at the son, who now looked more like a stranger than family. In that moment, Max realized this wasn't just a business betrayal. It was a family one. The meeting dissolved into murmurs and shifting chairs. Evan moved on briskly, outlining new marketing strategies and profit forecasts, as if he hadn't just carved a canyon between father and son. Max sat still, his pen unmoved, eyes fixed on the notepad before him. The ink had smudged where his hand trembled. He heard numbers being tossed around: percentages, projections, client acquisitions, but they floated past like meaningless noise. All he could hear was Ellen's voice from years ago one day. "Max, this company will be Evan's future. Everything you're building is for him." And God help him, Max had believed it. He remembered the early days when the company was nothing but a dream and a rented office space that smelled of damp carpet. Back then, he had worked from sunrise until the streetlights flickered on, taking side jobs on construction sites just to cover payroll. His hands had been raw, his back screaming in protest, but he never complained. Not when Evan needed braces. Not when Caitlin needed money for textbooks. Not even when Ellen's medical bills began to climb. Sacrifice had been the rhythm of his life. It was the unseen backbone of everything his children now enjoyed. He remembered one winter night long before the company had turned a profit. The furnace had gone out in their old house, and the children had slept in jackets and hats. Ellen had looked at him across the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee, and asked if they would ever make it through. Max had taken her hand, calloused and rough, against her soft skin and whispered, "We will. I promise you one day this will all be worth it." It had been worth it, hadn't it? At least he had thought so until tonight. Max lifted his eyes from the notepad and studied his son. Evan looked the part of a modern executive, clean suit, confident posture, polished words. But beneath that confidence, Max saw something he hadn't wanted to admit before: arrogance, entitlement, a hunger for approval from everyone except the man who had given him everything. It wasn't just about age or image. No, this was about erasure. Evan didn't want him as a partner or even as a fatherly guide in the background. Evan wanted him gone. Out of sight, out of mind. Max felt his chest tighten as a memory pushed its way in a very different conference room 20 years earlier. Evan had been a teenager then, sitting sullenly in a chair at the bank, while Max begged for a loan to keep the business afloat. The banker had shaken his head at the numbers, saying the risk was too great. Max had walked out empty-handed but undeterred. That night, he'd sold his truck to cover payroll. He could still picture Evan's face when he came home in a borrowed car. "Where's the truck, Dad? I sold it," Max had said, simply setting down his work boots. "We needed the money for the company." Even then, he'd hoped Evan would understand the cost of sacrifice. But looking at him now, tall, confident, dismissive, Max wondered if his son had ever understood at all. As the meeting droned on, Max's gaze wandered around the room. Jenna caught his eye briefly, her expression smooth but sharp like glass. She was younger than Evan, ambitious, always pushing for bigger, flashier contracts. She had never hidden her impatience with Max's old-fashioned ways. "Clients don't want to see a man in his 50s with rough hands and old stories," she had once said. "They want sleek, modern." Tonight, Evan had given her those words back, wrapped in cruelty and dressed as leadership. Max's jaw tightened. The betrayal wasn't just business. It was blood deep. His son wasn't only trying to edge him out of the boardroom, he was cutting him out of the family legacy. For a brief moment, Max thought about standing up and walking out, letting them see what life without him would look like. But he stayed seated, quiet as stone, because something inside him shifted that night. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. A recognition. He realized that everything he had sacrificed, the truck, the house, the years of his back breaking under weight, had raised children who now measured worth not in love or loyalty, but in money and appearances. And as Evan's voice filled the room, smooth and confident, Max thought of Ellen again. Her warning echoed faintly in his memory. Don't give them so much that they forget to be grateful. He lowered his pen at last and folded his hands. They thought he was old, weak, irrelevant. But Max had built everything once before from nothing. And if he had to, he would build again. Only this time it wouldn't be for Evan. The meeting finally adjourned with the clatter of laptops closing and chairs scraping across the polished floor. Executives gathered their papers and left in twos and threes, whispering about quarterly goals and holiday bonuses. Max stayed seated a moment longer, staring at the oak conference table he himself had chosen 20 years ago. He remembered the day he had signed the papers to purchase it, the ink still fresh on the contract. It was expensive then, too expensive really, but he had wanted something solid, something that told clients they were dealing with permanence, not a passing dream. Now that same table felt like a witness to his erasure. He rose slowly, his knees stiff from years of climbing ladders and hauling lumber in the days before the company turned respectable. He adjusted his jacket, nodded politely to an associate who avoided his eyes, and walked out. In the hallway, the muffled laughter of Evan and Jenna trailed behind him. He didn't need to hear the words. He already knew what they were saying. Outside, the winter air hit his face sharp and clean. The sun had dipped low, staining the sky with streaks of orange. Max drew a deep breath and let it fill his lungs. Something about the cold steadied him. He drove home alone, hands loose on the steering wheel. His truck was old, 10 years past its prime, but he kept it running himself. He liked the feel of it, the smell of grease and sawdust that clung to the seats. It reminded him of who he had been before the suits, before the polished boardrooms. Back then, people didn't dismiss him as too old. They respected the calluses on his hands because they knew what those hands had built. At a red light, Max's mind wandered back to Ellen. She had been the compass in all those years of struggle. When the business first faltered, she had worked nights at the diner just to make sure the mortgage stayed paid. She used to tuck notes into his lunch, small slips of paper that read, "Keep going. We believe in you." She wasn't here to write notes anymore. But if she had been, he knew what she would say. Stand tall. Don't let them break you. At home, the silence pressed in. The house felt bigger since Ellen passed, every creak of the floorboards echoing too loudly, every shadow stretching long. He sat in his armchair staring at the mantel where her picture still rested. She was smiling in that photograph, a warmth in her eyes that no illness could ever dim. Max spoke into the emptiness. "You'd be ashamed of what he said today, Ellen. Our boy, the way he looked at me." His voice broke, then steadied again. "But I won't let him take everything. Not yet. Not ever." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the crackle of the old furnace. That night, Max lay awake, turning the betrayal over in his mind. Not with the hot, reckless anger of youth, but with the measured calculation of a man who had lived long enough to know that patience often delivered the sharpest justice. He began to notice things he hadn't paid attention to before. In meetings, how Jenna pressed Evan's hand under the table when she wanted him to cut Max off. How the younger associates followed Evan's lead, eager to impress the man they thought was the future. How no one ever asked Max for guidance anymore, though it was his instincts that had kept the company alive through recessions, through downturns, through crises that would have swallowed lesser firms whole. It was all fuel now. Every smirk, every dismissal, every whisper. Fuel for a fire he hadn't yet let them see. He started small, observing, listening, filing away details. He asked quiet questions of old friends in the industry, men he'd worked with back in the days of dust and sweat, men who remembered what his word was worth. Still got that contract with Gray & Sons, he'd ask casually over coffee. Thinking about new partnerships, another hinted eyebrow raised. Max only smiled noncommittal. But inside the gears were turning. He knew Evan and Jenna believed they had all the leverage. They thought of him as a relic, someone to be edged out politely and eventually forgotten. But Max carried something they could never replicate: history. Relationships built not on charm or polish, but on sweat, on trust, on years of showing up when it counted. He had planted the seeds long ago, and those roots still ran deep. By the end of the week, Max found himself in his study late at night, surrounded by old ledgers and contracts. The house was quiet, except for the ticking clock. His fingers traced the ink of his first major deal, the signature of a client who had taken a chance on him when no one else would. Max leaned back and whispered into the silence, "They think I'm finished. They think I'm too old. But they have no idea who they're dealing with." In the darkness of that room, a plan began to take shape, not born of bitterness, but of resolve. The betrayal had cut deep, but Max had lived long enough to know that the deepest cuts often carved the clearest paths. And his path was only just beginning. The following Monday, Max arrived at the office earlier than usual. The parking lot was nearly empty, the building still hushed in the gray light of dawn. He'd always preferred mornings like this, when the world seemed to belong only to those willing to rise before it stirred. He walked through the glass doors, nodding at the janitor Miguel, who was polishing the lobby floor. Miguel had been with the company for over a decade, one of those unseen men who kept things running smoothly. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," Miguel said with a respectful nod. "Morning, Miguel." Max paused, lowering his voice. "How's your boy doing college applications?" Right? Miguel's face brightened. "Yes, sir. Got an acceptance letter from Colorado State last week. First in our family to go." Max smiled, genuine and proud for him. "That's wonderful. Congratulations. You tell him he's got a bright road ahead." As Max continued upstairs, he realized this was what Evan and Jenna never understood. The company wasn't only profit margins and polished presentations. It was people relationships woven over years, trust earned in small gestures. He carried those bonds like armor, though no one else in the boardroom seemed to notice. By 7:30, he was in his office, with the blinds half drawn. The desk bore the marks of years of use, scratches from careless pen taps, faded patches where sunlight had bleached the wood. He reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out a worn leather notebook. Ellen had bought it for him years ago, insisting he record not just numbers, but thoughts, reflections. Inside were pages filled with names, phone numbers, sketches of contracts, notes about people he'd met across decades. Builders, suppliers, clients. Some still alive and active, others retired, but still loyal. He flipped to the most recent page, where he had begun to list names again, this time with a sharper purpose. At the top of the page, allies. His pen hovered, then he wrote Gray and Sons call Arthur. He remembered Arthur's father, a gruff man who had once shaken Max's hand and said a man's worth is in how steady he stands when the wind blows. Further down, Riverside Materials check contracts. Max had built half his early projects with their supplies. He still remembered when their trucks rolled in late one winter night, headlights, cutting through the snow so his crew could finish a deadline that had seemed impossible. He closed the book with a decisive snap. That evening, instead of heading straight home, Max drove across town to an old diner tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. It hadn't changed in 20 years. The neon signs still flickered and the booths still smelled faintly of coffee and fried onions. Arthur Gray was already there, nursing a mug of black coffee. His hair had gone thin and silver, but his handshake was still firm. Max Hayes, Arthur said, leaning back with a grin. Haven't seen you in a long while. What brings you here? Max slid into the booth. Needed to talk. About business. About family. Arthur studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Heard your boy's running things now? He's trying to, Max replied. His tone carried no anger, just a measured calm. But he's forgetting something. He's forgetting what built this company in the first place. Arthur raised an eyebrow. And you haven't. Max sipped his coffee. I haven't. And I don't intend to let him destroy what we built. They spoke for an hour, the kind of quiet conversation that didn't need grand gestures. Max explained just enough Evan's dismissive words, Jenna's whispers in meetings, the sense that they were plotting to edge him out entirely. Arthur listened, his weathered face betraying little. But when Max finished, Arthur set his mug down with a solid thud. Max, I've seen men like your son. They think the world owes them because they stand on ground someone else laid. But you, he pointed a finger for emphasis, you laid that ground. Don't forget it. Max nodded slowly. He felt the truth of those words settle in his chest. When he left the diner, the night air was sharp with cold, but inside he felt a warmth that hadn't been there in weeks. He wasn't alone. Back at his house, Max placed the notebook on his desk and underlined Arthur's name. As he turned off the lamp, he glanced once more at Ellen's photograph. They think I'm finished, he whispered. But the storm is only beginning. The clock ticked steadily in the quiet room, and for the first time since his son's cruel words, Max slept without waking in the dark. By the end of that week, Max could feel the subtle tremors under the surface of the company. It wasn't just about quarterly profits anymore, or efficiency, or the new software systems Jenna insisted would modernize everything. It was about something more primal: loyalty. On Monday morning, Max walked into the office to find two of the younger managers whispering in the hallway. They stiffened when he passed. One of them, a boy barely 30, offered a polite nod, but quickly turned away. Max had seen that look before, the awkwardness of someone who knew which side they'd already chosen, even before the battle had truly begun. Inside the conference room, the tension grew thicker. Evan sat at the head of the table, deliberately in Max's old seat. He wore the crisp navy suit Max had given him for his first promotion years ago. Funny how clothes outlive gratitude. We'll be restructuring some of the client portfolios, Evan announced with a confidence that sounded rehearsed. I've spoken with Jenna and a few of the board members, and we believe the company needs to focus on younger, fresher leadership. The words weren't aimed at the room. They were aimed at Max. Max sat 2 chairs down, his hands folded calmly on the table. He felt the weight of eyes on him, the veterans who had built the company alongside him, the newcomers eager to prove themselves. Rosa, his late wife's younger sister, who'd worked in accounting since the early days, avoided eye contact, her brow furrowed. She had always been torn between loyalty to Max and affection for his son. Jenna leaned forward, her smile too smooth. Clients want to see energy, adaptability. We're not saying there's no place for experience, but image matters. There it was. The line drawn as plain as ink on a page. Max cleared his throat. Image without substance crumbles fast. This company was built on trust, on showing up when others didn't. Remember the Riverside project during the blizzard of '02 when every other contractor walked off the site and we stayed, we finished. That's what kept clients coming back, not flashy suits or buzzwords. The room shifted, murmurs rippling among the older managers. Evan's jaw tightened. That was 20 years ago, Daddy said sharply. This is a new era. You don't understand the market anymore. Max met his son's gaze without blinking. He saw not just defiance, but calculation, the coldness of a man convinced he was already winning. After the meeting, Rosa approached Max quietly in the hallway. He's different, Max. I don't know what's gotten into him. Max sighed, the weariness showing in the slope of his shoulders. Power. It changes people. Or maybe it just reveals what was already there. She touched his arm gently. You know you still have people here who believe in you, right? He gave her a faint smile. I know. And I'll need them. That night, back at his house, Max pulled out his leather notebook again. Under allies, he added Rosa's name. Not because she worked for him. She was family blood and memory, but because he knew she would stand as a witness when the time came. For the first time in years, he also wrote Ellen's name again, though she was gone. He needed to see it on the page. He needed to remember who he was fighting for and why. Later, he sat on the porch, the autumn wind scattering dry leaves across the yard. The house creaked like an old friend, and he thought of the decades it had held him, sheltered his family. Evan thought all of this was his inheritance, his inevitability. But Max knew better. Nothing was guaranteed. Not loyalty, not love, not even family ties. The line in the sand had been drawn. Evan and Jenna had shown their hand. Now it was his turn to show that the foundation he had laid was stronger than their ambition. Max closed his eyes and pictured Ellen's voice, soft but firm. Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful. He whispered into the night. It's time he remembered. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a fog. Max could sense the air thickening around him, though few dared to speak it aloud. Clients he'd known for decades began rescheduling meetings, some sending junior representatives instead of coming themselves. Max wasn't naive. He knew what was happening, whispers in back rooms, subtle nudges from Evan and Jenna rewriting the company's story without him in it. One afternoon, Max received a call from an old client, Mr. Richards, a man who had trusted him through 3 economic recessions. Max, the voice on the other end hesitated. I don't know what's going on in your office, but Evan told me you're stepping back. That you're not handling projects anymore. Max's grip on the phone tightened, the ache in his chest flaring. Is that so? He said evenly. Funny. I wasn't aware I'd retired. Richard sighed. Look, I trust you, Max. Always have. But the way they put it, it sounded like you were ready to rest. Maybe I should be dealing with Evan from now on. After the call, Max sat alone at his desk, staring at the blueprint of a warehouse project they'd been working on. His own son was cutting him out piece by piece until he was nothing more than a relic in the company he had built with his own hands. That night, Rosa stopped by his house with a casserole. She had always been like that, showing up when she knew he wouldn't ask for help. She set the dish down on his table and studied his face. You look like hell, Max. He chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Feels about right. She pulled out a chair, lowering her voice. I hear things in the accounting office. Evan's been moving numbers around, prepping for changes. Jenna's in his ear every hour, telling him how to rebrand the company. They think you're too old to notice. Max's eyes narrowed. And what do you think, Rosa? I think you're not as broken as they believe. She reached across the table, her hand warm on his. But if you let them keep whispering unchecked, they'll bury you alive. Max nodded slowly. He'd already begun preparing in silence, but Rosa's words strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't just defend himself. He'd let them walk far enough down their path that when the trap was sprung, it would shake them to their core. Later that week, Max ran into another longtime colleague, Samuel, one of the senior project managers. Samuel leaned in, speaking quietly, almost nervously. Max, I owe you too much to stay silent. They're saying you're slipping, that your mind isn't as sharp that you forget details. They're planting doubts. Max's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice calm. You've worked beside me 20 years, Sam. Have you seen me forget a detail that mattered? Samuel shook his head. Never. That's why I wanted you to know. They're playing dirty. Max thanked him, then walked to his truck, his mind buzzing. Whispers. Rumors. The slow erosion of a reputation that had taken him a lifetime to build. As he drove home, the autumn leaves swirled down the street, dancing in the headlights, like sparks from a dying fire. He thought of Ellen again, how she had stood beside him in the lean years, when bills stacked higher than paychecks, when they'd eaten rice and beans for months, so the company payroll would go through. She had always believed in him, and now his own son dared to call him a liability. That night, Max sat at his kitchen table, pulling out his leather notebook again. He added 2 more names under allies, Rosa and Samuel. Witnesses. People who still remembered what he'd built. He also scribbled a single line across the page. Whispers don't last. Proof does. For the first time in weeks, he felt steady. They were playing their game in shadows, but Max knew where the light switch was. And soon enough, everyone would see. Max had always been a man of records. Years in construction taught him that one misplaced decimal could bring a roof down, that every measurement, every permit, every check stub had to be precise. He trusted paper more than he trusted people. Paper never lied. So when the whispers turned into rumors and the rumors into silence around conference tables, Max knew where he needed to look. Proof. One Saturday morning, he pulled down an old cedar box from the top shelf of his closet. It had been there for years, untouched since Ellen's passing. Inside lay neatly labeled folders arranged with the meticulous care Ellen had once teased him for payroll, 1,997-2005. Taxes, 2006-2010. Contracts, 2011 present. As he opened the folders, the faint scent of cedar and dust filled the room. He traced his finger over Ellen's handwriting on a sticky note she'd once left him. Don't throw these away, Max. You never know when they'll matter. Her voice echoed in his ears, soft but certain. And now, years later, it mattered more than ever. Max spent hours at the dining table spreading out contracts and client agreements. Each document was a thread in the tapestry of the company's history, his history. The first big warehouse contract signed in ink when he'd still been wearing his work boots to meetings. The city permits he'd fought tooth and nail for. Even the original incorporation papers with his signature bold and certain his son's nowhere in sight because Evan had been in high school then. The evidence was clear. This wasn't Evan's company. It wasn't Jenna's company. It was his. Built with his sweat, secured with his sacrifices, carried on Ellen's faith. That afternoon, Rosa stopped by with fresh coffee, curious about the stacks of paper covering his table. Looks like you're preparing for a trial, she joked gently. In a way, I am, Max said without looking up. They want to rewrite history, Rosa. But history's written right here. He tapped the contract beneath his palm. She leaned over, her eyes widening at the rows of signatures. Max, you kept everything, every bill I paid, every contract I signed, every late night I covered payroll with my own savings. They can call me old, call me useless, but these papers won't let them erase me. Rosa nodded, a mixture of admiration and sorrow in her gaze. You always were thorough. Ellen would be proud. For the first time in weeks, Max smiled. Ellen's the reason I kept them. She said one day I'd need proof of what I gave to this family. She was right. The next day, Max carried a small selection of the files to his office. He placed them in his drawer, separate from everything else. He noticed Evan glance at him curiously when he saw the folders, but his son said nothing. At lunch, Samuel slipped into Max's office, shutting the door quietly. "You've got something, don't you?" Max studied him for a long moment. Samuel had lines on his face that came from loyalty and work, not deceit. "I've got enough to show the board exactly who built this company." Samuel exhaled almost in relief. "Good. Because they're planning something big, Max. A rebranding announcement, maybe even restructuring. Evan's been talking to outside investors." Max's hands tightened on the folder in front of him. "Without me?" Samuel gave a grim nod. That night, Max sat at his table again, staring at the files spread out like pieces of his soul. The papers told the story of a man who had given everything: his youth, his health, his marriage, to build a legacy. And now his own son wanted to strip it away. But Max was no fool. He wasn't going to shout or fight blindly. He would let them walk straight into the spotlight they craved, only to have the truth projected larger than they could handle. As he gathered the papers back into the cedar box, Max whispered to himself, steady, "And sure, they think age makes me weak. But memory is sharper than they know. And I've got the paper trail to prove it." The papers gave Max strength, but even he knew paper alone could not fight whispers. In business and in family, truth was louder when it had witnesses. The following Sunday, Max drove his old pickup to Rosa's house. His sister lived on the outskirts of town in a modest brick home with a porch covered in pots of geraniums. She had always been the one to tell him when he was being too stubborn, the one who'd stood by him when Ellen's hospital bills piled up. Rosa opened the door before he even knocked, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of his worn briefcase. "You've been digging," she said. "I've been remembering," Max replied. She made coffee and they sat at her kitchen table, sunlight pouring through lace curtains. Max laid out the contracts, payroll receipts, and loan papers. Rosa studied them slowly, her finger tracing his signature on the pages. "They think you're just some old man to be brushed aside," she said finally. "But you've got proof. This company, this legacy, it's you." Max nodded, but his voice was quieter. "It won't be enough unless others see it too. I need people who know my sacrifices, people who can stand up and say I was there. That it happened." Rosa leaned back, folding her arms. "Then you need Samuel, and Pastor John, and maybe even Mrs. Henderson." At the mention of his neighbor's name, Max chuckled bitterly. Mrs. Henderson had watched him build the company from their small garage back when she'd bring Ellen iced tea while he worked through summer afternoons. She'd seen the trucks, the late nights, the weekends he missed birthdays just to keep payroll alive. "I'll talk to them," Max said. The next day, Samuel stopped by Max's office again, locking the door behind him. He had always been discreet, a quiet man who valued loyalty above profit. He looked over the stack of documents Max had laid out on the desk. "This is gold, Max. If you present this in front of the board, Evan won't just lose credibility, he'll lose face. And once he loses face, the investors will turn cold." Max gave a tired smile. "That's the idea. But Samuel, when the time comes, I'll need you to stand beside me, to confirm what they already know deep down, that I built this company brick by brick, and Evan is standing on my shoulders." Samuel placed a hand over his. "When the time comes, I'll be there. I owe you more than a paycheck, Max. You taught me everything I know. You gave me a career. I won't forget that now." Later that week, Max walked into St. Andrew's Church, where Pastor John was finishing his evening prayers. The church smelled of old wood and candle wax, familiar and grounding. John had presided over Ellen's funeral, his voice steady as Max's world crumbled. Pastor Max began softly, "I may need your help. Not with prayers, though, those never hurt, but with something more worldly." John listened as Max explained, his voice never rising, never faltering, though his hands trembled when he spoke of Evan's betrayal. The pastor's eyes softened, lines of compassion etching deeper into his face. "Max, you have carried this family longer than most men could. If they are trying to erase that, then truth must be spoken out loud, and I will stand by you when the time comes." By the time Max left the church, the sun had set and the streetlights glowed like small candles against the night. For the first time in weeks, his steps felt steadier. As he drove home, Max pictured the gathering storm. Evan was planning his takeover blind with ambition, while Max was quietly drawing his allies closer. Rosa, Samuel, Pastor John, even Mrs. Henderson, each of them a witness, each of them a piece of the truth Evan couldn't bury. He parked in front of his house, staring at the windows glowing warm in the dark. Inside the cedar box of papers sat waiting, silent but powerful. His allies would bring those papers to life, Max whispered to himself. As he locked the door, they think they'll silence me in front of the board. But when the time comes, I won't be standing alone. The week after meeting with Rosa and Pastor John, Max began to notice how the walls of his company seemed to hum with rumors. A smile that lasted too long, a whisper that cut short when he walked into a room, the faint tremor of something shifting underneath the ordinary. Evan was preparing his move. Max could feel it like a storm crawling up the horizon. But Max wasn't standing idle anymore. He had begun to weave a circle of quiet strength around himself, witnesses, allies, people who remembered not just what the company was, but who had built it. One evening, Max stopped by Mrs. Henderson's porch. The widow had been his neighbor since Ellen was alive, a woman who carried memories the way others carried photographs, firmly with care. She poured him lemonade just as she had 30 years earlier when he worked in the garage with sweat dripping down his back and tools scattered around his feet. "I heard Evan's been talking big," she said, leaning on the railing. "But I also remember who hammered nails until midnight, who nearly lost his marriage over missed suppers, who built this place with nothing but calloused hands and faith. I'll tell anyone who asks." Her words were steady, and they sank into Max's heart like anchors. The next day, Max drove across town to see Carl Jenkins, an old supplier who had extended him credit in those lean years when banks had shut their doors. Carl was retired now, his hands swollen from arthritis. But when Max laid out what Evan was doing, Carl's eyes burned with the fire of memory. "Boy thinks you're old. He wouldn't have a company to inherit if you hadn't begged me for steel when nobody else would." "I'll testify to that in any room." Max shook his hand, the grip soft but meaningful. These weren't just allies, they were living chapters of his sacrifice. Meanwhile, Samuel kept feeding Max tidbits from inside. Reports that Evan had been meeting investors alone, painting himself as the sole visionary, whispering that Max was too fragile, too outdated to be trusted. Max listened without anger. Instead, he wrote everything down, his engineer's handwriting neat and deliberate, in a worn notebook. Betrayal didn't surprise him anymore. What mattered was proof, witnesses, the irrefutable voice of truth. On Sunday, Pastor John invited Max to stay after service. The pews were empty, sunlight pouring in through stained glass, scattering colors on the wooden floor. "Max," he said, "sometimes God lets injustice stretch just long enough so that when truth arrives, it shines brighter. When the moment comes, you will not be standing in shadows." That night, Max returned home and opened Ellen's cedar box again. The papers were there, the old contracts, the deeds, the notes that proved how much he had risked. But now something more stood behind them, names, faces, voices ready to speak for him. Rosa, Samuel, Pastor John, Mrs. Henderson, Carl Jenkins. Each of them, a brick in the wall he was building to withstand Evan's ambition. Max sat by the window, the house silent, except for the creak of the old beams. He thought of his son, the boy who once ran across these floors, clutching toy trucks, calling him Dad with pride. How strange that the same boy now whispered that he was too old, too embarrassing, too unnecessary. Yet, Max no longer felt crushed. He felt steadied. His sacrifice would not be erased, not this time. And so, late into the night, he began to sketch his plan, not with blueprints or measurements as he once did, but with conversations, alliances, and timing. There would come a day, perhaps soon, when Evan stood before the board with his slick suit and hollow promises. And when that day arrived, Max would not simply defend himself. He would rise with proof in hand and witnesses by his side and remind everyone who had built the foundation they stood on. He closed the notebook, whispered into the still air, as though Ellen could hear. "They thought I would be silent. But when the moment comes, I won't just speak. I'll roar." Evan had always been slick with words. As a boy, he could talk his way out of trouble faster than his friends could even think of excuses. Max used to smile at that charm, thinking it would serve his son well in the business world. Now he realized charm without character was a double-edged sword sharp enough to cut even family. By early spring, Evan was moving fast. He called private lunches with board members, ordered presentations filled with flashy graphics, and whispered promises of expansion and modernity. "My father had his time," Evan would say in that polished voice of his. "But times have changed. We can't afford to look like a relic if we want to compete." Max heard about these meetings through Samuel, who slipped in copies of Evan's proposals. The words were polished, but the heart was hollow. Evan spoke of margins, trends, and branding opportunities. Nowhere in his slides was there mention of the people, the workers who'd stayed loyal. For decades, the families who'd fed their children because of steady paychecks. "He talks like the company is a stock portfolio, not a life's work," Samuel muttered one evening, dropping a folder onto Max's kitchen table. "He's trying to erase your fingerprints." Max leafed through the documents, each phrase cutting deeper. Streamline leadership. Optimize generational succession. Reduce redundancy. Redundancy. That was what Evan called him now. Not a father. Not a founder. Just a redundancy. At home, Max sat in the chair Ellen had chosen for the living room. The fabric was worn smooth, where she used to rest, a quiet testament to evenings filled with laughter and soft conversation. He imagined her voice. "Don't let him steal what you built, Max. Don't let him forget who you are." The next morning he visited Rosa. His sister had always been sharp, a woman who saw through facades quicker than most. When Max showed her the proposals, she pursed her lips. "He's grooming them. You see, promise a little profit, dress it up in shiny words, and suddenly half the room forgets who laid the foundation." She tapped the papers. "But foundations don't lie, Max. People know the truth, they just need reminding." Meanwhile, Evan turned up his campaign outside the boardroom too. He invited clients to dinners where he played the role of the modern executive, flashing smiles and shaking hands. He hinted to them that the old man was stepping back, that he, Evan, was the future. At one dinner overheard by a supplier loyal to Max, Evan laughed and said, "My father means well, but he's a relic. I'll clean things up soon." When the supplier repeated those words to Max, something inside him flared, not anger, but a steady fire of resolve. He had been underestimated before. He knew how to survive nights on construction sites with nothing but coffee and grit, how to stretch $1 until it bent into $2, how to carry a family on his shoulders without complaint. If Evan thought he could erase all that with clever dinners and boardroom whispers, he had miscalculated. Yet Max didn't rush. He let Evan believe his plan was working. He let him build his tower of arrogance higher and higher, brick by brick. Because Max knew the higher the tower, the harder the fall. At church that Sunday, Pastor John reminded him justice isn't always about fighting back with fists. Sometimes it's about letting pride set its own trap. Max nodded. He could already see the trap forming, even if Evan couldn't. Back at the office, Samuel brought more news. Evan was preparing a succession announcement for the next shareholder meeting. He planned to stand before everyone, investors, employees, board members, and unveil his vision of the company's future without his father. Max closed his notebook after Samuel left. The living room grew quiet, shadows stretching as evening settled. He could almost hear Ellen again, her voice soft but firm. "Wait for the right moment. Then speak, so no one can forget." For now, Max waited. Let Evan polish his lies. Let him spread them far and wide. Because when the boardroom lights shone brightest, Max would step into them carrying the truth, and the betrayal would no longer be hidden in whispers. Max had never been one to dwell on the past, but lately memories pressed down on him like heavy bricks. Each time he walked through the company's offices, the polished glass doors, the neatly arranged cubicles, the faint hum of machines in the workshop, he saw not just a business, but his life carved into every wall. Late one evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Max wandered down to the workshop floor. The smell of sawdust still lingered, faint but comforting, like a ghost of his younger days. He ran his hand along the smooth railing of the stairwell he'd installed himself, remembering the calluses that had once split his palms. Every corner here had a story, the support beam he'd reinforced after a storm nearly toppled the roof, The break room fridge he'd hauled in with Samuel when money was too tight to hire movers. The office windows he'd cleaned himself before the grand opening. He paused at the wall of old photographs still hanging near the lobby. The first crew's faces younger than they had any right to be, grinning through dirt and sweat. Ellen stood beside him in one of the pictures, holding little Evan on her hip. She had that radiant smile that could light a room, her eyes full of pride at what they had built together. Max felt his throat tighten. He'd promised her this business would give their son a future. That promise had cost him decades of 16-hour days, missed holidays and nights where he returned home too exhausted even to speak. But promises, he thought bitterly, were fragile things. He remembered the day Evan turned 16 and asked for his first car. Money had been tight, yet Max had stayed late at job sites for weeks, working until the moon replaced the sun. When he finally drove home a second-hand Honda and handed Evan the keys, the boy's face lit up with joy. "You're the best dad," he had said then. Max held on to that memory now, wondering how the same boy had grown into the man who would call him an embarrassment. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just about a company. It was about love spent like currency every hour, every sacrifice poured into giving Evan a foundation. And now Evan wanted to rip that foundation away as if it had never mattered. Samuel found him there staring at the photographs. "You look like a man carrying a mountain," Samuel said gently. Max forced a small smile. "Some mountains I built myself." Samuel glanced at the pictures. "You gave him everything, Max. Everyone knows it. Don't let him convince you otherwise." But Max shook his head. "He doesn't remember, Sam. Or maybe he chooses not to. To him, all this is just profit and leverage." To me, his voice trailed off. He touched Ellen's smile in the photograph with the tips of his fingers. "To me, it's family. Blood, sweat, promises kept. And now, betrayal." They stood in silence for a while, the hum of a distant heater, the only sound. Finally, Samuel said, "He's planning his big reveal. But he's forgetting one thing: you built this place brick by brick. The people here know that. They'll remember if you remind them." That night, Max drove home slowly, letting the city lights flicker across his windshield. He thought of the mortgage payments he'd struggled to meet. In the early years, the second jobs, the sacrifices Ellen had made wearing the same winter coat year after year so Evan could have new shoes for school. He remembered eating beans for dinner while saving enough to buy new equipment for the shop. He remembered the way Ellen had squeezed his hand and whispered, "We're doing this for him, Max. For our boy." And now that boy, grown into a man, was erasing him. At home, Max opened an old box tucked away in the attic. Inside were receipts, contracts, even Ellen's notes from when they first dreamed of the business. He spread them across the kitchen table, the weight of years filling the room. If Evan wanted to convince the board that Max was outdated, then Max would show them what outdated really meant: loyalty, sacrifice, and truth written in sweat and ink. He whispered into the quiet, as if Ellen were still there. "If he wants a fight, Ellen, he's going to get one. Not with fists. With the truth." The next morning, Max sat in his office early, the sun just beginning to filter through the blinds. He wanted a moment of silence before the day began. But silence didn't last long in a company full of ambitions, some noble, some dangerous. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices from the conference room. Evan's voice, smooth and confident, carried easily Dad's old-fashioned. "He means well, but he's slowing things down." Clients don't want handshakes and stories about the old days. They want innovation, fresh faces, and sleek presentations. Max froze where he sat. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words drifted through the crack in the door like poison. Another voice answered Michael, a young project manager Max had hired just a year ago. "But, Evan, your father still owns the majority of shares, right? Doesn't that make him untouchable?" There was a pause, and then Evan laughed, a short, dismissive sound that sliced through Max's chest. "Not for long. We're working on restructuring. If we get investor backing, the board can be persuaded. Once Dad's shares are diluted, he'll have no real authority left. He can retire gracefully," or Evan let the sentence trail off his tone, heavy with implication. Max clenched his jaw, his hand gripping the armrest until his knuckles went white. Gracefully, he thought. as though being pushed out of the company he built brick by brick could ever be graceful. When the meeting adjourned, Max stayed hidden in his office, listening to the shuffle of footsteps. He waited until the last voices faded before stepping out. The hallway was empty, but the air still hummed with betrayal. That afternoon he passed by the boardroom again and saw Evan giving a presentation. The young man stood tall in a tailored suit, the kind Max could never have afforded at his age, gesturing toward slides projected on the wall. Words like market expansion, mergers, next-gen leadership glowed across the screen. Max leaned quietly against the doorframe unseen. He watched as Evan moved through the slides, charming the board members with easy confidence. He spoke of new energy and visionary direction. Not once did he mention who had laid the foundation, who had kept the lights on when banks threatened foreclosure, who had worked with his bare hands when there wasn't money for contractors. Instead, Evan painted himself as the natural heir, the future of the company. "My father's heart is in the right place," he said, with a rehearsed smile, "but sentiment can't guide a business anymore. The market doesn't care about nostalgia." Max felt his chest tighten. Nostalgia, that was what Evan called sacrifice. Decades of labor, sweat, and love reduced to nostalgia, like an old photograph tucked in a dusty box. One board member, Mr. Caldwell, raised a hand. "What about your father's reputation with the community? He's the reason many long-term clients trust this company." Evan didn't falter. "We'll honor that history, of course. But history doesn't keep a business alive. Growth does. And growth requires change." The room murmured in agreement. Some nodded. Some leaned back pensive. Evan's words carried weight. He was weaving his web, and Max could see how easily others were caught in it. That night, Max sat alone at his kitchen table, the documents he'd unearthed from the attic spread out before him. Receipts of tuition paid. Invoices of medical bills covered. Mortgages refinanced. He thought of Evan's words, nostalgia. No, he decided. These papers weren't nostalgia. They were proof. Proof of a life lived, of sacrifices made, of promises kept. Still, the betrayal stung. Evan was not just cutting him out of a business, he was cutting him out of the story entirely. Max knew that if he did nothing in a few months, his name would vanish from the company he had built. But he would not vanish quietly. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. A message from Rosa, his sister, heard Evan's been making big moves at the company. "Are you okay?" Max stared at the words. He could almost hear Rosa's voice, laced with worry, but also strength. She had always told him not to let pride blind him, but also not to let injustice slide. He typed back slowly. "I'm fine. But Rosa, I may need you soon. There's a storm coming." He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. His heart was heavy, but beneath the weight, a seed of resolve had begun to take root. If Evan wanted to erase him, Max would make sure his revenge was written in ink too permanent to ignore. The next evening, Max drove across town to his sister Rosa's house. Her little cottage sat on a quiet street, lined with oak trees, the kind of place where neighbors waved, and kids rode bicycles past in the late afternoon. Rosa had always chosen warmth over wealth. Her home wasn't big, but it was filled with light and the smell of fresh bread she baked every Sunday. She opened the door before he even knocked, as though she'd been waiting. "Max," she said softly, wrapping him in a hug. Her hair had gone silver over the years, but her embrace was still the same steady grounding. "You heard, didn't you?" Max asked, once they were inside, his voice low. Rosa guided him to the kitchen table, where a teapot steamed gently. She poured him a cup before answering. "I hear enough to know that your son is making moves that don't sit right. People talk, Max. Clients, board members, even the receptionist. They say Evan's looking to restructure the company." She looked at him with eyes sharp as ever. "And they say you're not part of that future." Max's hand tightened around the warm ceramic cup. "He stood in front of the board today and called me nostalgia," he whispered. "As if my life's work was just some old story that doesn't matter anymore." Rosa shook her head, her eyes flashing. "That boy forgets too easily. He forgets who taught him to swing a hammer, who drove him to night school classes, who kept food on the table when times were lean. He's building castles with bricks you laid, Max." Max let out a long breath. "I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting." Maybe this is just how young men talk when they're ambitious. But then I remember what I heard with my own ears. He's not waiting for me to step aside. He's planning to push me out. Rosa reached across the table, her hand covering his. Listen to me. You are not overreacting. You're waking up. There's a difference. Her words cut through the fog in his chest. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the kettle whistle faintly on the stove. Then Rosa leaned back, her tone softening. Max, you've always given more than you should. For your wife, for your kids, for that company. You never thought of yourself first. But maybe it's time you did. Because if you don't, they'll take everything, including your dignity. Max's throat tightened. I don't want revenge, Rosa. I just wanted a family business where my son and I could work side by side. I thought I was building a legacy. You did build one, Rosa said firmly. But legacies don't always go to those who inherit them. Sometimes they go to those who honor them. Evan has shown you who he is. Now the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Max looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred hands that had built homes, lifted steel beams, fixed broken machinery. Hands that had signed contracts and comforted children. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I can't let him humiliate me, Rosa. Not after everything. Rosa studied him, her eyes narrowing. Then you need to be smart. Don't fight him where he's strongest. Don't go head-to-head in a shouting match. He'll just paint you as an old man clinging to power. You need proof. You need witnesses. And you need a moment where the truth can't be denied. Her words hung in the air like a blueprint slowly forming. Max nodded slowly. He thought of the binders of receipts and documents sitting in his study. He thought of the investors Evan had been courting. He thought of the boardroom, the same place where his own son had tried to erase him. Rosa reached for the teapot and refilled his cup. Max, if you need someone to stand by you when the time comes, I will. I'll be there. And I'm not the only one. You still have people who remember who you are, what you've done. Don't forget that. For the first time in weeks, Max felt the faintest spark of strength flicker inside him. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. He left Rosa's house that night, with the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. The streets glowed under the amber light of lampposts, and his truck hummed steadily beneath him as he drove home. Evan thought he had the future sewn up. But Rosa was right. Max still had allies. He still had the truth. And when the moment came, he would not let his son's betrayal stand in the shadows. It would be dragged into the light. The following Monday, Max arrived at the office before dawn. The sky outside was still ink dark, and the city hummed faintly with trucks beginning their morning rounds. He stood at the tall glass windows of the building he had helped build from scratch once, just a dusty construction yard, now a headquarters with polished marble floors and a company logo gleaming in the lobby. He smoothed the collar of his worn gray suit, the one Ellen had chosen for him years ago, when the company first signed its largest contract. He could almost hear her voice. You look like a man who built something out of nothing. Max stepped into the boardroom, its long mahogany table waiting silently. He took his seat at the far end, laying out a leather folder bulging with papers. The room smelled faintly of coffee and varnish. He folded his rough hands together and waited. One by one, board members filed in, some younger, fresh faces eager to climb. Some older men who remembered the early days with Max when he had worn a hard hat instead of a tie. They nodded at him politely, though he sensed the unease. Word had already spread about Evan's growing ambition. Finally, the door opened, and Evan strode in. His suit was sharp, his tie expensive, his confidence brimming. He didn't look at his father as he adjusted his cufflinks and took the central chair as though the seat had already been claimed. Gentlemen, Evan began smoothly, and ladies, he added with a nod to Mrs. Holloway at the far end. Today I want to outline the direction for the company's future. A modern strategy. One that leaves behind outdated methods, and his eyes flicked toward Max for a fleeting moment, outdated leadership. A ripple passed through the table. Max felt his jaw tighten but kept silent. Instead, he watched studying Evan as Rosa had advised. Evan launched into a slick presentation, projected numbers on a screen, flashy branding ideas, expansion plans into markets that Max knew were unstable. The younger board members scribbled notes, dazzled by talk of innovation and disruption. When the floor opened for questions, Max finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of decades. "Evan," he said, "can you tell us how you plan to fund this expansion? What capital will you use?" Evan smirked slightly, as if the question was naïve. "We'll leverage existing assets. The company has plenty of equity to pull from, especially in properties." Max leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. "And what happens when those assets are tied directly to projects still unfinished? Or when clients demand collateral on their contracts, do you have contingency plans?" A pause. The younger board members looked up, pens hovering. Evan shifted his polish cracking ever so slightly. "We'll manage risk as it comes," Evan replied quickly, waving a hand. Max didn't let go. "That's not management. That's gambling with people's livelihoods. With every paycheck in this room." The silence was thick. Some of the older members nodded subtly, remembering Max's cautious strategies that had saved the company through recessions. Evan's jaw clenched. "This isn't about fear, Dad. This is about vision. If we stay stuck in your cautious ways, we'll become irrelevant." Max let the words hang, then opened his leather folder. He laid out papers, receipts, invoices, old balance sheets marked with his handwriting. "These," he said quietly, "are the records of every dollar I invested when this company was just an idea. The second mortgage I took on my house. The nights I spent laying bricks during the day and calculating payroll at midnight. You want vision. Vision isn't standing in front of a screen with projections. Vision is betting everything you have to make sure the men who worked for you could feed their families." A murmur rippled through the board. One man, Mr. Carter, cleared his throat. "Evan, I'd like to see detailed risk assessments before we vote on anything." Another nodded. "Agreed. Numbers look good, but projections aren't guarantees. We can't jeopardize the foundation Max built." For the first time, Evan looked cornered. His smile faltered. "This is why we need fresh leadership," he snapped, "not stories about the past." Max stayed silent, letting the board see the contrast for themselves: flash versus substance, arrogance versus sacrifice. The meeting adjourned with no decision, made Evan visibly frustrated, his jaw tight as he packed his laptop. He avoided his father's gaze as he stormed out. Max gathered his papers slowly, his heart steady. He hadn't won, not yet. But Rosa was right. He didn't need to fight loud. He needed to fight smart. And tonight he had planted doubt in the board's mind. He walked out of the building into the cool evening air. For the first time in weeks, he felt the balance shift ever so slightly back in his favor. By the next morning, whispers had begun to travel through the hallways of the company like drafts of cold air in an old house. Max could feel them as soon as he stepped through the glass doors. Conversations cut short when he passed employees glancing between him and the conference rooms where Evan liked to hold court. It had always been that way in family businesses. People watched, people chose sides, and people remembered who had built the foundation beneath their paychecks. Max walked slowly down the hall, his leather folder under his arm, and noticed two junior accountants murmuring by the coffee machine. When they caught sight of him, one straightened up nervously, as if he had been caught doing something wrong. But Max only nodded politely, his eyes tired but kind. "Morning, gentlemen," he said. "Morning, Mr. Harper," they replied almost in unison, the respect in their voices sharper than Evan ever earned from them. In the elevator, Max overheard another pair of voices, two project managers speaking in hushed tones about Evan's big gamble. One of them mentioned late-night drinks where Evan had boasted about expansion deals not yet signed. Another worried aloud about layoffs if the plans collapsed. Max didn't interrupt. He just listened, storing every word like nails in a box. He knew from a lifetime in construction that you didn't start hammering right away, you gathered your tools first. That evening, Rosa stopped by his house. She set a casserole on the counter, the smell of roasted chicken filling the empty kitchen. She could tell from his face that something had shifted. "They're talking, aren't they?" she asked, folding her arms. Max nodded slowly. "They're beginning to see him for what he is. Not yet enough to move, but enough to question." Rosa smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed serious. "Doubt is the first crack in any wall. You know that better than anyone." Max remembered all those years on job sites inspecting concrete foundations. The smallest fissure, if left unchecked, spread until the whole structure came tumbling down. The next day at the office, an older foreman named Paul sought him out. Paul had been with Max since the early days, back when they had a single truck and a handful of workers. His hair was white now, but his back was still straight. "Max," he said in a low voice, "I don't like what I'm hearing. Evan's talking about cutting safety corners to push projects faster. You and I both know what that means." Max's chest tightened. "Accidents," he murmured. "Men hurt. Families ruined." Paul nodded grimly. "We built this company different. Everyone knew if you worked for Max Harper, you'd come home safe at night. Evan's gonna burn that reputation to the ground if someone doesn't stop him." The words struck deep. Reputation. It was the only currency Max had left, and Evan was about to squander it. By Friday, Max could see the undercurrent flowing stronger. Secretaries exchanged worried glances. Site supervisors lingered in his office doorway to ask how he was holding up. And in the cafeteria, he caught snippets of employees saying Mr. Harper would never have done it that way. Evan, blind to the whispers, strutted through the halls with the arrogance of a man who mistook fear for respect. He dismissed caution as cowardice and loyalty as weakness. That afternoon, Max walked into his office, shut the door, and sat heavily in his chair. On his desk lay the leather folder with the old records of sacrifice mortgages, receipts, every bill he had paid to keep the company afloat. He touched the papers, then looked out the window at the skyline he had helped build. The whispers outside his office were growing louder, but whispers alone wouldn't topple Evan. What Max needed was something undeniable, something public, something symbolic. And as the dusk settled, painting the city gold, he realized Rosa had been right again. This fight wouldn't be won with anger. It would be won with timing and proof. He closed the folder, his eyes sharper than they had been in years. For now, he would let the whispers spread. Let them do the work of weakening Evan's walls. And when the time came, Max would be ready to strike the final blow. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray day when the sky pressed low over the city and everyone moved a little slower. Max arrived at the office early, as he always had, his thermos of black coffee in hand. He had barely set down his coat when Rosa called. "Max," her voice came quick, tense. "Have you checked your email today?" He frowned. "Not yet." "Why, there's chatter," she said. Something leaked. Evan's expansion proposal, the one he bragged about last week, people are saying it's full of risky loans and exaggerated numbers. It's all over the internal network. Max sat heavily in his chair, his pulse steady. He turned to his computer, clicked into the inbox, and saw it a chain of forwarded messages, documents attached. Spreadsheets, projections, contracts. Evan's name stamped across every page. And the numbers told a damning story. Inflated revenue forecasts. Contracts with vendors no one had vetted. Debt stacked so high the company's foundation quivered beneath it. Someone had slipped these files into circulation. Max leaned back, hands folded over his stomach, letting out a slow exhale. He hadn't leaked them, though the thought had crossed his mind. Someone else, maybe Paul, maybe one of the younger managers, tired of Evan's swagger, had decided to act. By noon, the whispers that had filled the halls became louder, no longer afraid. Employees huddled in corners, heads bent over printouts. "This is reckless," one said. "He's betting the whole company on hot air," another muttered. Max kept quiet. He knew better than to push the fire. When a building was already burning, you didn't need to fan the flames. That afternoon, Evan burst into the office like a storm. His face flush red, his voice echoing down the hall. "Who leaked those files?" he shouted. "You think you know better than me. You think you understand growth doors cracked open." Eyes peeked out. For the first time, Evan's rage didn't inspire fear, it revealed weakness. Max stayed in his office door half open. When Evan stormed in, slamming the papers onto the desk, Max looked up calmly. "You've seen it?" Evan demanded. Max nodded. "I have." Evan leaned forward, palms flat, trying to reclaim authority. "It's strategy, Dad. Aggressive, yes, but brilliant. They don't understand. You need to back me up in front of them. Remind them who built this place. Max studied his son's face. The arrogance. The desperation just beneath it. And he thought of all the years he had hammered nails, balanced books, sacrificed weekends to give this boy a future. I did build this place, Max said softly. That's why I won't back you up. Evan froze. While you're gambling with people's lives, Max said, his voice steady. These men and women you think they're numbers on a page? I know their names. I know their kids. I won't let you burn everything down. For a long moment, only the hum of the office filled the air. Evan's jaw worked, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a sneer, he gathered the papers and stormed out. Max sat in the silence that followed, his hands trembling just slightly. He wasn't Evan would fight harder now. But the tide had turned. The staff had seen the truth for themselves. Later that evening, Paul called him. Max, I don't know how those files got out, but people are furious. They're saying if you step up, they'll stand with you. They're ready for change. Max closed his eyes, the weight of decades pressing down. He thought of his late wife, her voice in his ear on those long nights. Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful. Then it's time, Max murmured. Time to remind him where this company really came from. He opened his leather folder again, laying out the old receipts, the mortgage papers, the records of sacrifice. Tomorrow he would begin assembling not just a defense, but an undeniable story. Because numbers could be twisted, but sacrifices could not be erased. The night after the leak, Max sat in his kitchen with the folder spread open across the table. Papers yellowed with age, contracts worn soft at the edges, bills scrawled with notes from nights long past. Each sheet was a piece of his story, a map of sacrifice. The old clock above the stove ticked past midnight when his phone buzzed. It was Rosa. You're still awake, aren't you? She asked, her voice both tender and knowing. Max chuckled softly. Always could read me too well. Come by tomorrow. I need your eyes on something. The next morning, Rosa arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and a box of muffins from the bakery she loved. She was 3 years younger, silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears, her presence like a warm blanket against the chill that had settled in Max's home. He cleared the table so she could see. Receipts for lumber mortgage payments, the loan papers for Evan's first business venture, all laid out in careful order. Rosa's eyes traveled across the spread, widening with every page. My God, Max. You kept all of this. I kept everything he said, his voice low. Every dollar I poured into this company, every dime I sacrificed. He thinks he built it. But I've got the proof. She touched one receipt gently as though it were fragile. This isn't just proof. This is a story. Your story. Max leaned back, rubbing his temples. I don't know if I have the strength to tell it. Rosa reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. You've carried this family on your back for 40 years. You've bled for it. Broken your body for it. Given more than any man should have to. You do have the strength. The question is, are you ready to finally put Evan in his place? He met her eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't see his little sister. He saw an ally. I'm ready, he said. Rosa nodded, a fierce determination lighting her features. Then you need to think carefully about how you reveal this. Quietly won't work. This isn't just about Evan. It's about everyone he's dragged along with him. The staff, the investors, the clients. They need to see the truth, and they need to see it in the open. You mean humiliation? I mean justice, Rosa corrected. You told me yourself he stood in front of that room and told you that you were too old, that you embarrassed him. He stripped you of your dignity in public. If you're going to take it back, you need to do it the same way. Max's chest tightened. He remembered the sting of those words, the way every face in the conference room had turned awkwardly away while his own son dismissed him like dead weight. I've been thinking about the shareholders' meeting next month, Max admitted. It's the one event Evan can't control. Everyone has a seat at the table. If I lay this down in front of them, they'll have no choice but to see him for who he is, Rosa finished. She smiled faintly. And they'll see you for who you still are. They spent hours organizing the documents into a timeline. Rosa's meticulous mind paired with Max's memories, the mortgage paid off bit by bit, the second job he'd taken on weekends to cover Evan's tuition, the home equity loan that had funded the company's first expansion. Every line told a truth that Evan had buried beneath ego. When they were finished, Rosa sat back and studied her brother. "You look lighter," she said. "Maybe because I finally know what I have to do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph. It was of Max and his late wife standing in front of the first construction site, arms around each other, grinning despite the mud on their boots. She slid it across the table. "Bring this too," she whispered. "Not just the money, Max. The heart. Let them see what was built and who built it. Let them see her." Max stared at the photograph, his throat tightening. He could almost hear his wife's voice again. "Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful." He slipped the photo into the folder. Then it settled. At that meeting, the truth comes out. Rosa stood her hand firm on his shoulder. "And I'll be there, Max. Right by your side. He won't face just you. He'll face everyone who still remembers what real sacrifice looks like." Max looked at her, gratitude welling deep inside. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of something he'd thought he'd lost hope. The days after Rosa's visit passed like the steady ticking of a clock. Max moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Each morning he spread the folder across his kitchen table, reviewing receipts and contracts, rehearsing the words he would speak when the time came. It wasn't just about facts, it was about voice. The very voice Evan had silenced in that boardroom when he told him he was too old, too embarrassing. This time Max would speak so clearly that no one could pretend not to hear. Still, he knew words alone weren't enough. He needed allies. People inside the company who remembered the beginning. People who had seen him lay the foundation both literally and figuratively. The first person he called was Harold Jensen. Harold had been with him since the early days when their office was nothing more than a rented trailer at the edge of a construction site. Harold was retired now, but his name still carried weight with old clients. "Max," Harold said, when he picked up his gravelly voice, warm with recognition. "I was just telling my grandson the other day about the summers we spent sweating through those high-rise jobs." "What's on your mind?" Max hesitated, then spoke. "I need a favor, Harold. It's time people remembered who really built this company. Not just Evan's name on the letterhead." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Harold chuckled. "About time. Tell me where and when, and I'll be there." Next came Maria Lopez, one of the earliest office managers, now running her own consulting firm. She had always admired Max for treating staff like family. "Evan tried to edge me out too," Maria confessed when Max met her for coffee. "He said I was too old school for his vision. I walked away before I punched him." "Would you be willing to stand with me?" Max asked quietly. Maria leaned forward, fire in her eyes. "Say the word." "I still have every payroll slip you signed to keep us afloat in those early years." He's rewriting history, but people deserve to hear the truth. Piece by piece, Max built his circle. Old employees, a supplier who'd extended credit when no bank would, even Pastor John, who remembered praying with Max outside the hospital when Evan had been born. Each person carried a fragment of the story, and together they made a whole. At night, Max would sit in his armchair, the folder heavy in his lap, Rosa's photo of him and his late wife tucked inside. He would practice aloud, speaking to the empty room as though it were filled with shareholders. His words were raw, at first full of anger, but Rosa's voice echoed in his memory, not just the money, Max. The heart. So he reshaped the speech. He talked about sacrifice, about how every nail hammered, every loan taken, every bill paid had been for family. He described standing in the cold dawn, pouring concrete with frozen hands, so that his son might have a warm home and a future. Sometimes his voice broke, but he never stopped. He knew that when the day came, it had to sound less like accusation and more like truth. The kind of truth no one could dismiss. One evening, Rosa joined him at the table. She listened as he read through his draft, nodding thoughtfully. "You sound like Dad?" she said when he finished. Max blinked. "What do you mean, our father?" Rosa said softly. "Remember when he stood up at Uncle George's funeral, everyone thought he was just a quiet man, but when he spoke, the whole room leaned in. Not because he was loud, but because he was real. You have that same weight in your voice now. Max sat in silence, humbled by the memory. The following week, invitations for the shareholders' meeting went out. Max received his copy in the mail, the company logo crisp on the envelope. He held it a long time before opening his hand steady. This will be it, he thought. The room where I was silenced will be the room where I speak. On the night before the meeting, Max laid out his suit, dark navy, the one his wife had bought him for Evan's college graduation. He pressed the collar himself, every motion deliberate. Rosa called just before bed. "Everything ready?" she asked. "Everything," Max replied. "Tomorrow, they'll hear it all." He hung up the phone and stood at the window. Outside, the streetlights bathed the snow in pale gold. The world seemed quiet, as though holding its breath. Max whispered into the stillness, as though his wife could hear him. "This is for you. For us. For everything we built." And in that moment he knew there was no turning back. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned gray and brittle, the kind of cold that clung to bones. Max rose early, his movements deliberate, ritualistic. He showered, shaved, and dressed in the navy suit his late wife had chosen years ago. As he buttoned the jacket, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back was older, yes, creases carved by time and sacrifice, but his eyes held a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. Rosa arrived just after 8. She was dressed in a charcoal skirt suit, her silver hair pulled back tightly. She carried a slim folder under her arm, her expression both stern and supportive. "You look ready," she said, her eyes sweeping over him with a sister's careful pride. "I am ready," Max replied. His voice carried none of the tremor that had haunted him weeks before. They drove in silence, the streets still damp from the night's snow. The city moved as though unaware that one family's story was about to fracture in public view. The corporate building rose ahead, glass and steel gleaming against the pale sky. Max parked his hands steady on the wheel. He paused a moment before stepping out, feeling the weight of years pressing down and the strange lightness of resolve lifting him at once. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Shareholders in suits clustered near the coffee station, their voices polite, controlled. At the head of the long polished table sat Evan Crisp in his tailored jacket, Jenna at his side, her smile polished like a veneer. When Max entered, the room stilled slightly. Some turned with polite surprise, others with cautious recognition. He hadn't been in this room for months, not since the day Evan had dismissed him as too old. Dad, Evan said, his tone a mixture of annoyance and forced civility. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us." "I'm still a shareholder," Max replied evenly, moving to his seat near the middle. "I have every right to be here." Evan's jaw tightened, but he smiled thinly. "Of course. Glad you could make it." The meeting began in its usual rhythm, numbers on screens, charts of quarterly growth projections for expansion. Evan spoke with the confidence of someone certain he was in control, his words flowing smoothly as he outlined future strategies. Jenna whispered occasionally in his ear, nodding with the composure of a partner already accustomed to her place in power. Max listened, his hands folded on the table, waiting. He could feel Rosa's steady presence beside him like an anchor in turbulent seas. At last, the agenda opened to questions and announcements. A shareholder, gray-haired and cautious, turned toward Max. "Mr. Hayes, you've been quiet. Do you have anything you'd like to add?" The room shifted, all eyes settling on him. Evan stiffened, clearly unprepared for what was coming. Max rose slowly, every movement deliberate. He drew the folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table with care. The room was silent, the hum of the projector the only sound. "I built this company," Max began, his voice firm, carrying without force. "Not alone, but with hands and sweat and sacrifice. 20 years ago, when banks turned us away, I mortgaged my home. When contracts fell through, I worked weekends taking shifts no one else wanted. Every beam, every foundation, every deal we earned through sacrifice." He opened the folder, revealing stacks of receipts, contracts, and faded photographs. This is the record of what it took. Loans paid off, mortgages covered, Paychecks delayed so employees could be paid first. Evan shifted his face, tightening. Dad, this isn't necessary, but Max raised his hand, silencing him with a quiet authority that made the room lean closer. I was told I was too old, that I embarrassed this company, that I embarrassed my own family. His voice cracked for the first time, but he steadied it quickly. But here's the truth. Without these sacrifices, there would be no company, no boardroom, no shares for anyone to sit on. Rosa leaned forward, her voice steady. I was there. I watched my brother break his back for this business while raising 2 children alone after his wife died. He never asked for applause, only respect. The silence was heavy electric. A few shareholders exchanged looks, murmurs rippling through the room. Evan stood, his voice sharp, defensive. This is ancient history. Business is about the future, not nostalgia. Max met his gaze evenly. The future has no foundation if you erase the past. He placed a single photo on the table himself, and Evan, years younger, standing before the company's first completed building. Max's arm around his son's shoulders, pride bright in his face. They told me I was too old. Maybe I am, but don't mistake age for irrelevance. Today, I won't be erased. The room seemed to hold its breath. Max didn't sit. He remained standing, shoulders square, as though daring anyone to deny the truth laid out before them. The reckoning had begun. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned gray and brittle, the kind of cold that clung to bones. Max rose early, his movements deliberate, ritualistic. He showered, shaved, and dressed in the navy suit his late wife had chosen years ago. As he buttoned the jacket, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back was older, yes, creases carved by time and sacrifice, but his eyes held a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. Rosa arrived just after 8. She was dressed in a charcoal skirt suit, her silver hair pulled back tightly. She carried a slim folder under her arm, her expression both stern and supportive. You look ready, she said, her eyes sweeping over him with a sister's careful pride. I am ready, Max replied. His voice carried none of the tremor that had haunted him weeks before. They drove in silence, the streets still damp from the night's snow. The city moved as though unaware that one family's story was about to fracture in public view. The corporate building rose ahead, glass and steel gleaming against the pale sky. Max parked his hands steady on the wheel. He paused a moment before stepping out, feeling the weight of years pressing down, and the strange lightness of resolve lifting him at once. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Shareholders in suits clustered near the coffee station, their voices polite, controlled. At the head of the long, polished table sat Evan, crisp in his tailored jacket, Jenna at his side, her smile polished like a veneer. When Max entered, the room stilled slightly. Some turned with polite surprise, others with cautious recognition. He hadn't been in this room for months, not since the day Evan had dismissed him as too old. Dad, Evan said, his tone a mixture of annoyance and forced civility. I didn't realize you'd be joining us. I'm still a shareholder, Max replied evenly, moving to his seat near the middle. I have every right to be here. Evan's jaw tightened, but he smiled thinly. Of course. Glad you could make it. The meeting began in its usual rhythm, numbers on screens, charts of quarterly growth projections for expansion. Evan spoke with the confidence of someone certain he was in control, his words flowing smoothly as he outlined future strategies. Jenna whispered occasionally in his ear, nodding with the composure of a partner already accustomed to her place in power. Max listened, his hands folded on the table, waiting. He could feel Rosa's steady presence beside him, like an anchor in turbulent seas. At last, the agenda opened to questions and announcements. A shareholder, gray-haired and cautious, turned toward Max. Mr. Hayes, you've been quiet. Do you have anything you'd like to add? The room shifted, all eyes settling on him. Evan stiffened, clearly unprepared for what was coming. Max rose slowly, every movement deliberate. He drew the folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table with care. The room was silent, the hum of the projector the only sound. I built this company, Max began, his voice firm, carrying without force. Not alone, but with hands and sweat and sacrifice. 20 years ago, when banks turned us away, I mortgaged my home. When contracts fell through, I worked weekends taking shifts no one else wanted. Every beam, every foundation, every deal we earned through sacrifice. He opened the folder, revealing stacks of receipts, contracts, and faded photographs. This is the record of what it took. Loans paid off. Mortgages covered. Paychecks delayed so employees could be paid first. Evan shifted, his face tightening. Dad, this isn't necessary, but Max raised his hand, silencing him with a quiet authority that made the room lean closer. I was told I was too old, that I embarrassed this company, that I embarrassed my own family. His voice cracked for the first time, but he steadied it quickly. But here's the truth. Without these sacrifices, there would be no company, no boardroom, no shares for anyone to sit on. Rosa leaned forward, her voice steady. I was there. I watched my brother break his back for this business while raising 2 children alone after his wife died. He never asked for applause, only respect. The silence was heavy electric. A few shareholders exchanged looks, murmurs rippling through the room. Evan stood, his voice sharp, defensive. This is ancient history. Business is about the future, not nostalgia. Max met his gaze evenly. The future has no foundation if you erase the past. He placed a single photo on the table himself, and Evan, years younger, standing before the company's first completed building. Max's arm around his son's shoulders, pride bright in his face. They told me I was too old. Maybe I am. But don't mistake age for irrelevance. Today, I won't be erased. The room seemed to hold its breath. Max didn't sit. He remained standing, shoulders square, as though daring anyone to deny the truth laid out before them. The reckoning had begun. The boardroom's doors clicked shut behind Max, leaving Evan and Jenna sitting in stunned silence as the shareholders murmured among themselves. The humiliation was no longer private. It was spreading like fire. Within minutes, word would leave this room, carried down hallways, whispered in elevators, and emailed across the company. By the time Evan stormed back into his office, his phone was already vibrating nonstop. Messages stacked one after another. Clients, employees, journalists, each asking the same unthinkable question. Is it true? Has Dempsey taken over? He slammed the phone onto his desk, pacing like a trapped animal. This can't be happening. He muttered more to himself than to Jenna. He blindsided me, my own father. Jenna stood by the window, arms crossed, her reflection pale in the glass. Evan's screaming isn't going to fix this. People are already talking. We need damage-control press releases, assurances of what Evan snapped. That we've lost majority control, that my father just handed the reins to our biggest rival. He dragged a hand through his hair. The polished CEO mask shattered, leaving only a frantic, furious son. Meanwhile, downstairs in the lobby, employees clustered in small groups. Some stared at their phones. Others whispered with wide eyes. A receptionist scrolled through an article, already live on a local business blog, construction giant Hayes and Company. Faces shake up after founder transfers shares to rival Dempsey. The headline was brutal. Photos of Max smiling with dirt on his face in an old newspaper clipping about the company's early days were plastered beside sleek shots of Evan at recent galas. The contrast was stark, the gritty builder versus the polished heir. By mid-afternoon, the company's stock dipped. Investors called anxious and suspicious. Longtime employees who remembered Max's hands-on leadership were quietly cheering, while others worried about what the future held. In a nearby diner, Rosa scrolled through the same headlines on her phone. She sipped her coffee, pride flickering in her chest. "You did it, Max," she whispered to herself, though her brother wasn't sitting across from her. "You finally reminded them who you are." Back at the office, Evan gathered department heads into the conference room. His voice strained as he tried to project authority. "We'll reassure everyone. This doesn't change operations. Dempsey may have shares, but I'm still CEO. Nothing moves without my approval." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Managers exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a man who had been with the company since Max's days on the job site, finally spoke up. "With respect, Evan, your father built this company's reputation. Clients trust him. And right now, everyone's saying Dempsey has more control than you. The words landed like a hammer blow. Evan's jaw tightened. He dismissed the meeting abruptly, but the damage was done. Doubt had seeped in. By evening, the humiliation spread beyond the business world. Friends of the family were calling. Old neighbors had seen the story on social media. Even Jenna's own parents had left a voicemail, their voices heavy with concern. What happened at the company? People are saying Max outplayed you. At home that night, Evan poured himself a drink, his hands shaking. Jenna sat across the room, scrolling furiously on her tablet. "They're eating it up online," she said bitterly. "Everyone loves the old man's story. Hard-working founder saves the day. You look like the spoiled son who tried to erase him." Her words were meant to be practical, but they cut deep. Evan downed his drink, his face twisted with anger. "He's ruined me, Jenna. My own father. In one day, he ruined me." Across town, Max sat in his modest living room, the evening news murmuring in the background. The segment showed his photo, grayer, older, but with a quiet dignity, and praised his decision to protect the company's legacy. He didn't smile, but there was a steadiness in his eyes. He had endured humiliation in silence for too long. Now it was his son's turn. Max leaned back, his thoughts drifting briefly to his late wife. "We did it, Ellen," he murmured softly, as if she were still listening. "He'll finally learn that respect isn't inherited, it's earned." And while the city buzzed with the fallout, Evan lay awake in his mansion, staring at the ceiling, the echo of his father's words ringing louder than the investors, louder than in the headlines, louder than anything else. "I may be old, but I am not weak, and I will never again be erased." The annual shareholder reception was meant to be a celebration. A glass atrium filled with white linen tables, polished cutlery, and an open bar that flowed with champagne. Waiters drifted through the crowd, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres, and a jazz quartet played quietly in the corner. It was supposed to be a night of confidence, of growth, of Hayes and Company, presenting itself as untouchable in a volatile market. Instead, it became a theater of humiliation. Evan stood at the podium, his tuxedo crisp, his expression taut with forced confidence. Jenna lingered nearby, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. He cleared his throat, scanning the crowd of investors, journalists, and longtime clients. "Tonight is about honoring our company's future," he began, his voice slightly shaky but striving for authority. "We've built a legacy of trust, of strength, of innovation." But the murmurs in the crowd were already louder than his words. Dozens of eyes were lowered toward phones, glowing screens, reflecting headlines spreading in real-time. Founder hands. Control to rival Dempsey acquires stake in Hayes and Company. Whispers rippled like wildfire. "Is it true? What does this mean for us? Wasn't the father supposed to retire quietly?" A few laughed bitterly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. And then, like salt in an open wound, the entrance doors swung wide. Max walked in. He wasn't dressed in a tuxedo. Just a simple gray suit, the kind he'd worn for decades at groundbreaking ceremonies and Sunday services. His shoulders were square, his step steady. The room, already unsettled, shifted entirely. Conversations hushed, cameras tilted, and suddenly every eye was on the old man who had once laid the company's first bricks with his bare hands. Evan froze at the podium, color draining from his face. "Dad," he said, his voice barely audible into the microphone. "What are you doing here?" Max didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the room, at the shareholders who had once visited his construction sites in hard hats, at the employees who remembered his hands-on leadership, at the community leaders who had stood by him when Hayes and Company was just a small-town firm with big dreams. "I came," Max finally said, his voice carrying with surprising strength, "because the truth deserves more than whispers." The crowd leaned forward. "For months," Max continued, "I was told I was too old, that I embarrassed this company, that my years of sacrifice no longer mattered. My own son," his gaze lingered on Evan, who shifted uncomfortably at the podium, "believed I was just a relic to be put aside. Forgotten." A murmur of sympathy swept the room. Even those who didn't know the details understood the cruelty of those words. "But let me remind you," all Max went on, his voice firm, this company was not built on arrogance. It was built on sweat, on sacrifice, on trust. And when I saw that trust eroding, I did what any founder who still loves his work would do. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. The lights caught the Hayes & Company seal at the top of the page. "I transferred my shares to Dempsey," Max said, clearly holding the paper high enough for the front rows to see. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to let my life's work be driven into the ground by greed." The reaction was instant. Gasps. Phones raised. A flurry of camera clicks. A reporter near the back already dictating notes aloud. Evan's composure cracked. "You blindsided me," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly through the microphone. "You betrayed me?" But Max's eyes didn't waver. "No, son," he said softly but firmly. "You betrayed me when you erased me. Tonight everyone will finally see the difference." The crowd erupted not with applause, but with a collective roar of voices. Some investors nodded in approval, others scrambled to reassess their positions. But the tide was undeniable. Max had shifted the narrative. One shareholder stood and clapped. Then another. And another. Soon a wave of applause filled the hall, not unanimous, but powerful enough to drown out Evan's sputtering protests. Max didn't linger. He simply placed the document on the podium in front of his son, nodded once to the audience, and turned to leave. Behind him, Evan's voice cracked into the microphone. "He's not the future I am," but the words rang hollow against the thunder of applause that followed Max out the door. And in that moment, Evan's humiliation was no longer confined to a boardroom. It was public, complete, and irreversible. The applause still echoed in Evan's ears, long after the atrium had cleared. He sat slumped in a leather chair in his corner office, bow tie, undone hair slick with sweat. The once proud son, who dreamed of being seen as a visionary, now looked like a boy caught in a lie. Jenna paced near the window heels, tapping against the hardwood. Her face was a storm of anger and fear. "Do you understand what just happened out there?" she hissed. "We're ruined, Evan. He made you look like a fool in front of every client, every investor." Evan slammed his fist against the armrest. "He blindsided me. Who does that? Who sabotages his own son? Don't twist this," Jenna snapped. "He didn't sabotage you. You did this to yourself. You told him he was old, useless, embarrassing. And now the world knows. Max didn't need to destroy you, he just told the truth." Evan's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout back to remind her that they had been building toward their own version of the company's future. But deep down, the words stuck in his throat. Because she was right. He had underestimated his father. The door creaked open, and Rosa, Max's sister, stepped in without knocking. She carried herself with the calm dignity of someone who had stood on the sidelines too long. Her voice was steady, but every word cut deep. "I warned you, Evan. I told you that pushing him aside would come back to haunt you." Evan's eyes flashed. "Aunt Rosa, this isn't your business." "It became my business," she said firmly, "the day you started treating your father like an obstacle instead of the man who raised you. He worked himself to the bone for you. And what did you give him in return? Insults. Dismissal." Evan stood, his anger boiling. "You think I don't know what he's done? You think I don't know how much he sacrificed? But times change. Clients don't want to see some old man in a hard hat stumbling through board meetings." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "No, Evan. Clients wanted to see integrity. That's what your father had. And that's what you lost." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Jenna folded her arms, turning her back on her husband. "Maybe your father just proved who the real leader always was." Those words hit harder than any shareholder's jeer. Evan felt the walls closing in the empire he thought was his slipping away with every passing second. He muttered almost to himself, "I'll fix this. I'll find a way to take it back." Rosa shook her head sadly. "Some things can't be taken back. Respect. Trust. Once you've lost them, they're gone. Just like your father's love." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Max has something now that you'll never have, Evan, dignity." And tonight the whole world saw it. When she was gone, the office felt colder. Jenna finally broke the silence, her voice quieter but sharper than before. "If you can't accept responsibility, Evan, then maybe I married the wrong man." because right now all I see is a boy who got outplayed by his father." Evan collapsed back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. He had wanted control, power, validation, but what he got was public disgrace, his wife's contempt, and the knowledge that his father, whom he thought he could erase, had the last word. In the dim light of that office, Evan Hayes reached his breaking point. The night after the boardroom storm, Max walked home slower than usual. His steps were heavy not from age, but from the weight that had finally lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the shame of being silenced, dismissed, or erased. He carried only himself, and that was enough. The street was quiet. Porch lights glowed in the distance, and the autumn wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke. Max pushed open the front gate of his modest home. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't full of polished marble or sweeping staircases, but it was his built from decades of sweat, sacrifice, and faith. And tonight it felt alive with peace. Inside, Rosa was waiting. She'd lit candles in the kitchen and brewed coffee strong enough to chase away the chill. Beside her sat Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had watched Max mow lawns in the rain, fix broken fences for free, and bring soup to her when she was sick. Pastor John was there too, his Bible closed on the table, his eyes kind. When Max entered, the three of them stood and clapped, not loudly, but with the soft rhythm of respect. "You did it," Rosa whispered. "You stood tall." Max smiled, lowering himself into a chair. "I didn't destroy anything tonight. I just told the truth. And the truth has its own power." Pastor John leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Max, I've given sermons for 40 years. But what you did in that room, what you showed your son and the world, that was a sermon without words. Dignity is the loudest gospel of all." Max's eyes grew wet. He reached for his coffee, letting the warmth settle his trembling hands. "I only ever wanted him to see me, to know that everything I built, this company, this life, was for him. But maybe what he needed to learn was that respect can't be inherited. It has to be earned." Rosa touched his arm gently. "And you earned it, Max. Tonight the community stood with you. Not because of contracts or money, but because they finally saw the man you've always been." Through the kitchen window, the neighborhood shimmered under the pale glow of the street lamp. A few kids laughed as they ran home, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. For Max, the sight wasn't ordinary. It was a reminder that life moves forward, that generations rise, and that love is measured in more than profit and control. Later, he stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the stars scattered wide across the Colorado sky. He held a single photograph in his hand, his late wife smiling with her arm wrapped around a much younger Max, the beginnings of the company still a dream on a blueprint beside them. "I did it, Ellen," he whispered into the night. "I stood my ground. They can't erase me anymore." The wind carried his words upward as though she were listening. Max closed his eyes, letting the silence fill him, not with loneliness, but with freedom. Behind him, Rosa called softly, "Come inside, Max. The coffee's still hot." He turned, smiling faintly. "In a minute. I just need to say goodnight." And with that, Max Hayes, the man once dismissed as too old, too embarrassing, felt whole again. Not because his son had changed, but because he himself had reclaimed what was always his dignity, love, and the quiet strength of a life well lived. Final note to our listeners: thank you for staying with this story until the end. Stories like Max's remind us that dignity, sacrifice, and love are never wasted, even if they go unseen for a time. If you've ever felt overlooked, may this tale give you courage. If you've ever carried the weight of family betrayal, may it give you strength. From our hearts to yours, we wish you health, peace, and happiness in your families. Remember, true wealth is not measured in money, but in love and respect. God bless you, and until next time, stay well, stay strong, and stay kind.